was in the grip of an ice age. While Australia stayed mostly free of glaciation, the climate went through periods of rapid and extreme changes. Dominating the country were huge species weighing up to 2,500 kilos, known today as megafauna. So, what could have caused almost 90% of these animals to disappear by 40 to 50,000 years ago? Paleontologist Aaron Kamens is travelling deep into the outback to an ancient lake bed that could contain important clues about whether climate change caused the demise of the megafauna.
Lake Callabonna is like nowhere else in Australia, or the world really. It's a huge salt lake today, but 50,000 years ago, there was a lot more water around. And literally thousands of megafaunal animals got stuck in the mud. And what this means is that we see, rather than just one or two bones, complete skeletons preserved where the animal got stuck. And because they're stuck in the mud, they're essentially partly buried as they die, which means that the fossilization detail is much higher. And that is something that we do not see anywhere else in Australia for any of these species.
It's been 4 years since Aaron's last visit to the lake.
It's exciting to be back here.
These shifting sands continually reveal new megafauna remains, while earlier discoveries disappear forever, eroded by the harsh desert conditions. Finding valuable evidence here is a race against the elements.
So here we can see that we've got to this one too late. So the bone is reduced to powder. If it's in that weathering zone, it can be eroded or weathered very, very quickly.
But amidst the crumble remains is a precious discovery.
Oh wow, this looks great. It's quite extensive too. So what we've got here is the skeleton from Diprotodon optatum, the thing that has made Callabonna famous. Up at this end, we've got the fragmented remains of the skull. This is so well preserved that we can see the body still as it was when the animal died. We've got the spine down the middle, the pelvis at the back, and the legs are still in the position where this giant marsupial fell over on its side. This is the biggest marsupial that ever lived. It stood about 2 meters tall at the shoulder, 3.5 meters long, weighed over 2 tons. So it's about the size of your urban SUV.
Diprotodons were widespread across much of Ice Age Australia. Males were much larger than females, suggesting they could have lived in small family groups characterized by one dominant male. Their large nasal cavities might have been used to make deep, grunting calls. Like koalas today, low frequencies would have allowed them to maintain social communication over long distances.
This is one of the most exciting parts of Callabonna for me.
The lake bed has safeguarded the most precious of details.
Nowhere else in Australia do we see the soft tissue of megafaunal animals preserved. If we have a really close look here, we can see this kind of dimpled surface. Now that is actually recording the foot pads of Diprotodon. So where Diprotodon got stuck in the mud here, the mud has wrapped around its foot, and that impression of the soft skin of the foot has been preserved for over 50,000 years.
Staggeringly, the remains of nearly 900 Diprotodons have been found at Lake Callabonna. So why did so many take their last steps here?
If we go back 50,000 years, Lake Callabonna is progressively getting drier. We're talking about a time of extreme climatic variability. And that change in climate could be one of the driving factors in what led to the megafaunal extinction.
As the lake contracted over time, animals were forced to move through the mud to get to the shrinking water supply. And the heavier the animal, the more likely it was to get trapped in a muddy grave. As temperatures become more extreme and rainfall changes, what was a fertile landscape dries out completely. The lake and its vital water has disappeared.
Now out at Lake Callabonna, we have a drought period, but that doesn't mean that that was what drove the megafauna extinct. At one area, we might see what's called extirpation, which is the local extinction of a group of animals, but that doesn't mean that they've gone extinct on a continental scale.
So, was drought driving extinctions in other parts of Australia? Over 1,300 kilometres to the east of Lake Callabonna, researchers are trying to determine if climate change could have caused megafauna to die out in other parts of the continent.
The back yellow one should be loosened, John.
Heidi Cadd is a paleoecologist who studies environments of the past.
Flip it.
Today, the team will drill down deep enough to extract sediment layers dating back 40 to 50,000 years.
Yep. Okay. When we take our cores out of the sediment, we see often just brown mud.
Ready? Okay, slow.
But when we take those cores back to the laboratory and we start to analyse them, that's how we can get a precipitation record. So that's how we can start to work out whether the changes we're seeing in the environment are related to changes in climate as well.
For the first time in tens of thousands of years, the lagoon's hidden history is revealed.
It's quite fibrous and peaty up the top here, and it looks like it changes gradually through here. Much finer here, but look down there.
Yeah,
that last
really
5
quite
centimetres
firm.
or so is very different, isn't it? Like you can feel an edge there.
This is very much lake sediments.
The sediment core tells a story of significant environmental and climatic change.
In the first part of our record, we see quite wet conditions. There's rainforest growing around the site, but as we move through between 60 and 50,000 years ago, we start to see some really dry conditions that shifts the vegetation into this open grassland kind of environment.
Shall we wrap it?
Yep, let's wrap her up. We've looked at other records along the east coast of Australia, and we've managed to find changes in the vegetation in a lot of these other records that corresponds to the climate changes that we're seeing at Welsby Lagoon.
Forensic analysis of these sediment cores has produced some of the most profound evidence of the existence and disappearance of megafauna in the area. Through, of all things, their poo.
What we have here are some photos from one of the cores that we've analysed from Welsby Lagoon. And what we see at the start of the record, so from 80,000 to 60,000 years ago, is Sporomyella spores. These are the dung fungi that come from megafauna, and we can see that during the time period where it's dominated by rainforest, we get quite a high abundance of these dung fungi. And then as we move forward through time, we start to see this drying of the climate just after 50,000 years ago, and we also see a change in the vegetation. And you can see we still see some spores of our Sporomyella in this period, suggesting that megafauna were still around, but the amount of the Sporomyella is much lower. And then again at about 40,000 years ago, we start to see really dramatic changes in rainfall. So quite dry conditions, which is also changing the local environment. And this also coincides with the time that we see the disappearance of Sporomyella. By 40,000 years ago, it looks like there was no megafauna living around this site.
How did this changing environment lead to the disappearance of megafauna here on Minjerribah?
The drying conditions that we see from Welsby Lagoon probably wouldn't have suited the megafauna particularly well. So they would have started to see changes in the food sources that they've been eating if the vegetation is starting to change. But we'd also be seeing a lot of the fresh water sources on Minjerribah and North Stradbroke Island start to dry up. And the megafauna would have been struggling to find food to eat and water to drink. And perhaps this catastrophic drying that happened during this 50 to 40,000 year period might have been enough to push the megafauna over the edge.
But there's another major change during this time that some academics think could have played a part in megafauna extinction. Was megafauna extinction caused by Earth's most successful predator, humans?